evening. We'll get started. My name is Cindy Arnson. On behalf of the Latin American program, delighted to welcome you this Friday morning to the Wilson Center. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the Latin American program, Veronica Colon Rosario, Christine Zeno, and research assistant Catherine Moffett for their help in putting this together, and also thank my colleagues in the Global Women's Leadership Initiative program for cooperating with us. We are sorry that we are not able to feature Dr. Ricardo Sabogal, the head of the Land Restitution Agency, who unexpectedly and at the last minute had to cancel his trip, but we are delighted to have not only Donny's presentation this morning, but also to have had the goodwill and collegiality of Adam Isacson of the Washington Office on Latin America to join us this morning. Those of you who are in the room know that Colombia is one of the countries with the highest level of displaced people in the world. It ranks number 2 after Sudan. There are various estimates of the number of displaced people. Something between 3.5 to 5 million are the figures that generally circulate, and a lot of those people were forced out of rural areas and off of their lands because of violence in rural areas by paramilitaries, by guerrillas, by drug lords. In fact, there is a term that I have not heard anywhere else except Colombia, which is the counter-agrarian reform that began in the 1980s and took off, especially from 1985 on, when large landowners and drug traffickers forced peasants off their land. The current government of President Juan Manuel Santos passed a historic piece of legislation in 2011, the Congress and the administration, to provide restitution for victims of rural violence. The law seeks to formalize and restore land rights for those who want to return. Donny Meertens has joined us for this entire year as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She normally is based at the Universidad Javeriana in Bogota. She's a social anthropologist who has spent decades researching agrarian issues in Colombia. She has served as a gender advisor for the United Nations for several organizations, and also was the rapporteur, and I'm sure she'll hold up the book, for one of the most important publications about this process that came from the Historical Memory Group of the National Commission on Reparations and Reconciliation. And she has focused on issues of gender, of women and land rights, and the extent to which land and gender issues in particular have come together as obstacles for women to claim land and enjoy their property rights. I'm also, as I said, very pleased to welcome Adam Isacson, who is a senior associate at the Washington Office on Latin America. Between his work at WOLA and at the Center for International Policy, he spent probably, close to 2 decades working on Colombia, has traveled there dozens and dozens of times, and has issued any number of reports, including one that's out on the table outside, on questions of U.S. aid and on the peace process. So we are delighted to join Adam and have, as I said, his generosity in participating this morning to offer some comments on how he views the land restitution process, as well as its connection to the peace talks currently underway in Havana and about to resume next Monday. So without further ado, Donny.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I want to thank the Wilson Center and the Latin American program for organizing this presentation. I want to thank to my interns for their professional and technical help, Peter McNamee and Ryan Eldridge, who are present here. And well, the subject, the title of my presentation is Land, Gender and Justice, Property Restitution and Women's Rights in Colombia's Transition to Peace. And I will be focusing on the Colombia's Victims and Land Restitution Law, which comprises humanitarian assistance, comprehensive reparations, and land restitution. But I'd like to highlight several aspects of this particular land restitution process and my research in it. I focus on Colombia's victims and land restitution law as an example of transitional justice that is dealing with the past, but also looking to the future. I think this is a crucial thing, that we are combining this dealing with the past and with past human rights violations and having a look at the future. And of course, in the context of the peace process, this is very important. One of the particular features of of this law and of other aspects of the process of restitution is that it's a kind of transitional justice measure that has been started during conflict. It's what we have called the Colombian way. There are still conflict. There are no peace agreements. There was a justice and peace law under which the paramilitary were demobilized, a very contested law and a very partial and controversial demobilization. I think this is a very important aspect to highlight in this process. Second, land restitution is a policy for restoring victims' rights. It is not a land reform, and this is one of the critical aspects and one of the critics of the critical comments and one of the critical points, what is going to happen after the restoration of these rights. Third, my research on this topic, my research scope starts with the historical memory work. I just showed the book on the mechanisms of land grabbing, and it goes on in a certain way. My current work builds on this historical memory work. It builds on the procedures, the workings, and the accomplishment of the current land restitution process. And I'm focused particularly on women's rights. But at the same time, restitution is an ongoing process. What I am telling you is just a view of the moment. It's very difficult to come to final conclusions because it's a process that's underway. It is a process that is changing, both in terms of statistics as in terms of and qualitative terms. And finally, as I say, that the transitional justice is looking at restoring rights, and restoring rights means looking at dealing with the past, looking at the past, but we also have to move on. And one of the big questions is what happens after restitution, and what does the restitution process contribute to future rural development, and particularly how can be gender equity part of a viable and a democratic rural development process, and how does this connect to the peace agenda? So before going to the Colombian case, I did some research on what happened in other parts of the world. There maybe you're familiar with the UN Pinheiro principles, which are on land, housing, and property restitution for displaced and refugees. And they have been applied in other parts of the world. Bosnia, in several African countries. before they were established, because they are established in 2005, there were experiences of land restitution after conflict in Guatemala, for instance. And generally speaking, they are considered to be a very difficult topic because of the totally different context in which they have been carried out. But after reviewing a lot of these experiences, I came to the conclusion that in spite of all those different contexts, there are similar gender issues at stake. And we can summarize these gender issues in that, generally speaking, there are no independent land rights for women, nor in many countries in the law or in customary law, or, and this applies to the Latin American case, in social practice. This means that mostly women's rights are defined through their relationship with a man. So, with this knowledge in mind, my research question was, does land restitution contribute to the promotion of gender justice in Colombia? How are women's rights to land accomplished? What are the obstacles? Are historical gender inequalities in access to land addressed? And what lessons may be learned? So now going to the Colombian case, I suppose you all know a lot about the Colombian conflict, but it was not until about 8 years ago, anyway, less than 10 years ago, that we started to ask about what happened to the land. So why land restitution, and who held the land, and who grabbed it? I want to say something about the term land grabbing, because we never found a good term in English for the Spanish word despojo. And land grabbing is not completely the same. So I will use land grabbing, I will use violent land seizures, and I will use dispossession as maybe a chain of events that together explain what happened to the land in Colombia. So the dynamics of war and the different actors of war and the armed confrontations, the massacres, the assassinations, the disappearances, the landmines led to, Cindy already mentioned it, massive forced displacement. And the official number at this moment is 5.5 million people. This is an official by the Historical Memory Group. And the victims unit has a new register, and they come to this amount in last year. So even in 2012, it was already 5 million. So, and of course, it is still growing since 1985. I just want to show you very briefly Colombia's map. This is a map of the land restitution unit, and it shows the areas they prioritized for land restitution. I will come back to what does this mean. We can say one way or another, these zones are the hotspots of land grabbing. And so they started it there. There are lots of claimants of these regions. And I want to, I haven't, just the northern coastern zones, the Caribbean coast, is a zone where I did we did with the team, the work on historical memory, and we are now I am now going to tell you about my findings in the restitution process in the same region. This is the departments of Córdoba, Sucre, Bolívar, and Cesar Magdalena. Of all this relation between the different acts of violence, and particularly massacres, and massive displacement, I just want to show this chart. These graphics show how there is a peak between 1998 and 2003, more or less, and this is for the Caribbean coast too, but really it is representative for the whole country, and it's representative for all manifestations, for all dynamics of war, even for the sexual violence, which is a topic I will mention later on. So we are talking about 5.5 million of displaced people. We are talking about 8 million hectares of abandoned land. And this is a confirmed number of hectares. This is a number given by the Ministry of Agriculture. But from abandoned land to dispossession, there is a kind of chain of events. And we came to know about this because of, first of all, the work of the Monitoring Commission on what happens to the policies for displaced people, the Comisión de Seguimiento, that figured out there are so many hectares of abandoned land. And then our historical memory work that figured out what are the mechanisms. So land grabbing, from land or from abandonment of land to dispossession, there are different moments. Many times dispossession takes place through illegal occupation or through forced selling far below market prices. Many times there are legal ploys used by powerful actors to get this illegally occupied land legalized with new titles. And to do this, they work with corrupt institutions like notaries, like the registry, like the Land Reform Institute too. Who are the victims? The victims are peasant smallholders, and many in the region I studied, like 80% came from agrarian reform areas. So this is also why we coin the word counter-reform, because really now these lands are in few hands, and they're again concentrated in a few hands. I'm not going to talk about the indigenous groups or about the Afro-Colombian groups. I just want to mention that they have particular decrees on how to restitute land to them, because they constitutionally have collective land rights, and they're particularly disproportionately affected by violence and by land grabbing. But there are only 2 cases of land restitution, one to an indigenous group, very recent, and one to an Afro-Colombian group. We will concentrate on peasant smallholders. Who are the beneficiaries? we are always thinking that the beneficiaries are the armed actors. But mostly the beneficiaries are the people behind the armed actors, and particularly behind the paramilitary. I think it's important to mention that according to the government, there is more or less half of the land that has been dispossessed is the actor is are the paramilitary, and the other half are the guerrilla. I'm not quite sure. It's very difficult to tell, but my experience is that generally the paramilitary occupied, violently seized the land, and then gave it to their political allies or to other economic actors at the local level, to local landholding elites. The guerrilla use the land, they use the land as corridors for moving people, arms, drugs, but they don't go through a complete process of dispossession and legalize the land at their name. So I think this is an important difference, and it should be confirmed if there is a possibility to work in guerrilla strongholds. There's still no land restitution in those regions where the guerrilla is strong. So I'm telling you this process, and I'm telling you this is for 80% going on in former regions of agrarian reform, and there's now a new land concentration process going on. And I want to give one example of this land concentration process. This is a process we documented. There are much more processes documented by others today, but I want to show this one. This is a case of 390 peasant holdings covering 15,000 hectares that are now concentrated in 20 new enterprises. And this is very important to see how complex the process is, because these peasant landholdings, these peasants were displaced between, let's say, 98 and 2003. This was this peak in displacement after massacres. But the legalization of those landholdings was in 2009. There are different reasons. Amongst others, that in 2009 there was enough time to evade, one of the one of the laws of the land reform says you can't sell your land holdings until 10 or 12 years after having received the land, after the land was adjudicated. So in this, if you look at the right bar, these are the 390 plots. More or less a third part of them are agrarian reform plots. So now coming to our central topic, what happened to the women during violence? There are two very important issues. Two areas of particular impact. One, I've called this the bodies, and the other one, the livelihoods. The impact of sexual violence in conflict has been very, not only very important in the Colombian conflict, it was also related, and it is still related, to processes of land grabbing. It has been used as punishment for women leaders, and it has been used as control over communities. And maybe it is one of the most effective weapons of control over communities, because it has caused displacement. Many times this sexual violence was related to massacres, but sometimes it was just a direct weapon to displace peasant communities, but they always have a second effect, and that is, it's not only the displacement, it's not only the violence itself, it's also the after effect, it's the silence, it's the shame. The community doesn't want to talk about this kind of violence, and it strengthens the fractures in community, and the fractured community is not very prone to claim lands and to rebuild their community. So it has been an important weapon of dispossession. And it is a permanent threat because perpetrators, particularly the paramilitary, are returning to the communities after paying their sentences, or they already returned to their communities without paying sentences in the demobilization process. I just want to give some statistics. In the victims registry in 2012, there were 1,754, but 2 years later, over the same period from 1985 until today, there are already 4,923 cases. So we see that the victims' law and the land restitution, but the victims' law opens possibilities, gives possibilities for people to start making their claims also about sexual violence. And one of the most difficult things is that there is a 98% of impunity in all these cases, and these are still all official numbers. So how do we know about these cases? Most of all, we know about them through the historical memory work and through the documentation by women's organizations. The second impact for women is the impact on their livelihoods. Their livelihoods are under threat. There's an over-representation of women as displaced heads of households. There are many widows amongst them. They live in extreme poverty. They generally have no ownership documents, so they are easy to dispossess. And they're family providers. If they're alone, they're women heads of households. So they were prone to sell at whatever price, because their land over there is still in violent zones, and they have to survive in the cities. So all these elements and these two impacts are big obstacles for restitution. And there are security risks both before the restitution process. That is, there are obstacles for women to start a process of claiming their land. But there are also obstacles after the restitution process, in the post-restitution, because these kinds of risks are going on. So I just want to show you how we worked with the historical memory process. We worked with special techniques, and we had both the anonymous narratives and the drawings of women's experience of violence. And this is very important to bring together all these elements of the chain of dispossession. But there is another obstacle. There's another element we have to think of when we are looking at how women's rights will be represented and guaranteed in the restitution process. And that is the historical discrimination in land rights. I read just 2 days ago this phrase in a Revista Semana. This was about violence against women of a man committed by a man in the political elite of one of the Caribbean coast departments of Cesar. A real man is master of lands and women, and this is still a very common saying. So what we see in practice is that women are equal in law, and their land rights are equal in law, but they are unequal in practice. And this has to do with the use of a male-headed household model in rural policy and in social practice, where always the land rights are associated with a male head of households. At the same time, among the peasantry, there's a very high level of informal land tenure. So in the former land reform schemes, we saw that women only were 11% of beneficiaries, which is really very, very low, because there were it was supposed that land had to be adjudicated to a family with a male head. We see in the registry of displaced people that women make up 26% of the displaced land owners or possessors, because nobody has formal land titles amounted, about the former possession of land. So there is, we see that in practice there are more women that register as heads of households. And we will see that this number is going up. So if there are no independent land rights for women, this means a whole series of obstacles for a restitution process. There's no legal proof, no social entitlement, so it's difficult to have even women themselves say, okay, I possess land. No, they will say, my husband or my partner was, my compañero was having the land, possessing the land. And this may cause problems too, as men still are seen as the rights bearers for the family. And many families broke up during displacement. And the men constitute new families and reclaim land with these new families. The women tend to disappear from this picture. They tend to disappear as victims. Another problem is that we found that women has displaced, and after the killing of their husbands, their in-laws considered that they had a right to the land, and they occupied the land. And sometimes also the neighbors claimed the land and occupied it. And women couldn't go back because they didn't want to confront these family conflicts. This is what I have called the horizontal conflict in the land restitution process, because it is between what they call the victims, or between at least people that are in the same position of power. But there are also what I have called vertical conflicts, and that is between these local landed elites or the companies and their lawyers, their attorneys that intimidate, and women are more easily to intimidate in these vertical conflicts. Just a small reminder before going on with the law and the restitution process, and that is in our historical memory work, the there is a kind of forgotten history, and it is that women were organizing too. And they were continuing peasant organizations when the National Peasant Organization broke up by repression, by the armed conflict, and was really yes, broken up as a national political actor. But at the local level, these peasant organizations continued under female leadership. So this is to keep in mind for, I will come back to this for my conclusions. So how does a land restitution work? The aspiration is to restitute to original possessors and to formalize land tenure. In a time span of 10 years, the procedures are starting with priority zones, do some social mapping and timelines, and this is a very important part of the whole procedure. This is the combination of an administrative procedure and a judicial procedure. The social mapping is meant to establish victimhood, to establish the context of conflict, to establish land tenure, to prove land tenure, and to establish also the social and the marital relationships. And then it goes to the judiciary part, and the claims and counterclaims, and will be validated in the court decisions. There are special measures that favor women's rights, prioritization of women head of households, flexibilization of proof. It's not only for women, but it favors women. They will give independent land titles and formalize land titles to women, and they will give joint land titles when they are married. They will forgive debts and assistance for productive projects, and assistance to and access to all kinds of social services in the post-restitution, and there are special measures of protection. So what are the accomplishments up to now? First point, 54,000 claims, 39% women claimants. So claimants are going up, and this has to do that during the displacement process, more families broke up, more female heads of households. So there are more women claimants. And this is the official report of 2 years implementation, 900 restitution court rulings. So there's a tremendous discrepancy between the number of claimants and the number of court rulings delivered. My research data in 10 priority zones, I've been reading 66 court rulings, 151 cases of restitution and formalizing titles, 27% women. So we see that there also is a lower number of women in the final court rulings than in the number of claimants. And we don't know, but probably this means that there are more difficulties in spite of prioritization of women heads of household. 98% of the formal land holdings were informal state lands or agrarian reform lands. And so the proof of tenure was resolved through this procedure of social mapping, which is a very detailed kind of ethnography of conflict, of historical memory work of conflict that they are doing in the context of this whole process. But still, it's very interesting to see there is a kind of male bias, because they are not the judges are not ruling, they're not saying, oh, there's a proof of tenure because of women are working the land. now they say, there is a proof of tenure because these women were related in the past to a man through a marital relationships, maybe an informal one, but we have established that she had a relationship with that man. So now her land tenure has been proved. And I think this is an important thing because working on the land, the exploitation is a proof of land tenure. It's a normal thing to prove land tenure. If you have worked for 5 years on the land, then this is a proof of land tenure for state lands. And then you can have a title. But this is for men, not for women. The rulings favor the victims, but mostly the conflicts and the counterclaims are what I have called horizontal conflicts. There is several concerns. There are cases of very small plots restituted to old age women. There are cases of small plots restituted to many rights bearers. There are cases of simultaneous families. And they are very concerned of giving rights back to all the women involved in the case of multiple marital relationships. And this certainly is an act or are acts of justice. But we have to ask what happens afterwards. Is this viable to return small plots and leaving to that, or do we need more measures to make it a viable rural development process? So the balance is the strength of the process. Independent and joint land titles are given to women. Victims' testimonies are extensively listened to. There's a recognition of the past, and they are formalizing rights. They are formalizing rights, and this is an important step towards the future. And this is also an empowering process because the victims are not only listened to, they also have their rights formalized and they are public. They are on the web. Yeah? And there are official court rulings. But there are a lot of weaknesses. In the procedures, I already mentioned this, the procedures are very slow, very complex, case by case. There are few vertical conflicts resolved. There's no organizational or communal context taken into account in the rulings. So sometimes in the same community, some lands are giving back and others are not given back to the same members of the community. And this common imaginary of women's access to land through a man are still present in the judge decisions. Then there are two important contextual limitations. The insecurity I already talked about, how the insecurity and the different forms of violence, particularly gender-based violence, hampers women's empowerment and paralyzes community rebuilding, and how the post-restitution is still a difficult process to know if there's a possibility for democratic development or if there's still an ongoing process of land concentration. And we think that this, our question is, will women landowners resist selling pressures after 2 years? They are allowed to sell after 2 years after restitution. They are generally disadvantaged in the vertical conflicts. They need more capacity building for competing in entrepreneurial environments, and they need more participation for building strong peasant reserve zones. So I come to my conclusions. Does the law contribute to justice for women in a post-conflict transition? Is it transformative of historical discriminations? And I say yes, because now women hold formal land titles that before they were, let's say, unprovable and not recognized. But at the same time, I say no, because there's no guarantee for sustainability, because of limitation in procedure, in accountability for gender-based violence, and for the post-restitution support. What to do? We are talking about the law, about institutions. We need civil society. We need, of course, political will. The technical questions of the law, they're already, I already mentioned them. They need to speed up. They need to have more coherence, more what I call collectivization of the decisions. That is not this case-by-case work. But there also are needed policies for a stronger gender-sensitive post-restitution scenario. And I think that one of the most important policies is organize women as new, independent and joint landowners. And I want to stress this point, organize women as new landowners. Also, victims' organizations should be strengthened. But victims' organizations are looking to the past in this transitional justice process. Their emphasis on the past. I think we have to organize women as new landowners because this gives them strength and this empowers them for the future. And so women should be participant in a strong, viable and dynamic peasant economy. And I'm saying complementary to entrepreneurial, agro-industrial and extractive activities. And this is part of what has been agreed upon in the first point of the peace agenda last year between the government and the FARC. Women should not be victims of unbridled land concentration. And of course, local governments should be accountable for gender-based violence. But I think the scenario for the future is that women can, as new landowners, empowered as new landowners, this will enhance their role in a democratic rural development, and they can work in different aspects. They will claim their rights to productive and social services. They may combat violence. Their protection will be much more effective if there's social cohesion and if there's social organization. And hopefully they will transform to the social practices. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, Donny, if any of us doubted the complexity of this issue, I think we now have a much fuller appreciation of the challenge, of the promise, and also the tremendous obstacles, going forward. So thank you for that very detailed and structured presentation. Adam.
Thank you, Donny. That was an incredibly well done piece of work and very hard to follow. But it certainly raised a few thoughts, though. And I'm sorry that Ricardo Sabogal isn't here. I saw him give a presentation at the Javeriana in March. And he is impressive. It's a very well thought through program of land restitution that they're carrying out. The strategy, he has a real sense of the needs that they have unmet, and of a lot of the legal and other obstacles that they're facing. So it's too bad that he's not here. So I'm going to be a lousy substitute for him. But I do see when I saw his presentation and just listening to Donny's, it does bring to mind that at the elite level, Colombia has now a rather long tradition of good intentions trying to fix this concentration of land that has plagued them and has been a key driver of the conflict for so long. You can go back to President Lopez Pumarejo's efforts at land reform in the 1930s, the campesino movement in the 1970s that came up with, that Donny mentioned, that came up with several accords with campesinos and some moves toward restoration of land, especially in the Caribbean region, which were then brought to a rather quick close by the Pacto de Chucoral in 1973. And then, of course, I think that the new land restitution effort that began in 2011 is part of that tradition. And it's also, you've got elite good intentions, at least coming out of the Bogota-based part of the elite. And the inability to move from good intentions to actual implementation is a larger issue that part of Colombia's elite faces. That some of the other recent programs that the Santos government has carried out, the National Territorial Consolidation Plan, the Labor Action Plan that has to do with the free trade agreement with the United States, I guess you could add the early warning system for human rights abuse, or the many accords that were signed with Campesino and other protesters last year have all been very slow to be implemented. And when you talk to officials in the Colombian government, you get a lot of explanations about, well, Colombia does have overlapping laws and jurisdictions, and there are many administrative obstacles, and quite often it just takes a long time to set up the relevant implementing agencies. I remember at a consultation with USAID a few months ago, they put up a slide that they couldn't share from the Land Restitution Unit showing this rather Rube Goldberg flowchart showing how difficult it is just to go from point A to the very end of a land restitution process. The print was too small to see it. It was such a difficult flowchart. Oh, much worse than that.
This is what they brought to that briefing.
Yeah, there was that one amazing slide that they couldn't share. So there are, and you do have to be a real expert in Colombia's legal system to understand what a lot of these obstacles, can be. Anybody who's followed just the Gustavo Petro back and forth about whether he can remain mayor or not shows how much these various jurisdictions overlap. But I think there's more than that. There's more than just what's on the flow chart to explain inaction. And Donny just mentioned political will. I think that, and I think this really gets to the heart of the credibility of these good intentions and the ability to implement them, which is going to be very important. I think it's important to President Santos' approval rating and maybe even his possibility of being reelected, but it's also important to the credibility of any commitments that are made in the peace process. And the questionable level of that credibility may even have some impact on whether the FARC are willing to give up weapons on day one, or whether they'll hang on and wait until there's actually some sign that accords are being implemented. And that variable, if you want to call it that, it would be the sort of Bogota-based Colombian elites' willingness or even ability to confront local power, local elites like what Donny calls the beneficiaries, the land grabbers, those who carried out the counter-agrarian reform, who sponsored paramilitarism. And I still think that we don't have a very great understanding of who exactly those people are, despite so many efforts. The great work done by people like Claudia Lopez or Mauricio Romero, Gustavo Duncan, and many others. The whole parapolitics scandal certainly blew the lid off part of who the identity of these local powers are. But even in places like Guatemala, many decades after the peace process ended, and there have been attempts at having truth commissions in Guatemala, and you have a whole UN commission to investigate and prosecute clandestine groups, you still don't have a real sense of who exactly are the families or the people or the industries or the companies that are really the most involved in what is really illegal behavior, and who would be the ones that the central government carrying out an ambitious program like restitution would have to push back against. We know that if you go to a place like Cesar or the Montes de Maria or many other Meta, that you have people who, when they're at challenges, when their interests are challenged, will push back violently. They don't necessarily play by the political rules. They prefer to. They certainly prefer to, and usually don't have to recur to violence, but have done so in the past, and sometimes by sponsoring the vast expansion of paramilitarism in the 1990s. But they usually don't have to, because They are local power. They have a lot of money locally, and they can get out the vote very easily. In order to win a national election, a national politician, like a Bogota elite national politician, may in fact have to depend on them for that getting out the vote, which sometimes involves vote buying, sometimes involves campaign donations. But those folks do also have seats in Congress, or their political groups do. It's hard to pass laws without them, so that makes them harder to confront also. They are very pro-investment climate, so they probably have some support from Bogota or even international-based business groups who don't necessarily have other interest in those regions. They operate by trying to penetrate the state, especially at the local level, by corrupting institutions so that those institutions are not useful in going after them. And that does make them harder to confront than a group like the FARC that operates by opposing the state in most areas. I should add, these hidden groups who we still have yet to identify, and there's a lot of work yet to be done, dangerous work, in identifying them, that these folks are overwhelmingly male. Although one thing that fascinates me about it is that when there have been efforts to uncover who they are, some of the most frequently signaled people are female. La Gata and Nilce Lopez in El Carmen de Bolivar, or really northern Bolivar, is one of the classic examples. The woman who managed to be in charge of a lot of the local sort of lottery and gambling. Or Sor Teresa Gomez in Cordoba, who a relative of the Castaño family, who is, I guess they just finally found her and arrested her, right? But she was one of the people most seen as concentrating lands in Cordoba and killing land rights defenders in that area. The Congress people, Rocio Arias and Eleonora Pineda. Now, these are the ones who seem to get most of the media play, even though obviously this is not a mostly female grouping. It's just the way that it's been portrayed, and it would be interesting to see more work into why that always ends up being the case. So you're not going to be able to really implement commitments without confronting these local groups whom we only have a generally hazy sense of who they are. And that really is important for the peace process. Now, I am optimistic that there's going to be a peace accord with the FARC. The seriousness and the discipline and the respect for confidentiality with which the talks have been carried out so far is unlike anything we'd seen in the last 3 attempts to negotiate with the FARC. The accords that have been reached so far are quite technical and not overly ambitious. They're certainly ambitious, but they're not. They do pass the laugh test. The question is, what happens after an accord is signed? And I would say, when's an accord going to be signed? Quien sabe? Who knows? But we do. I would say a key date, though, is October of 2015, when there are municipal and gubernatorial elections, and the FARC. This is, if they can't run candidates in that election, then they've got a long wait until they can again, because the next congressional elections are in 2018. So if they want to participate in those elections, they really do have to come to an accord several months before that, which is roughly a year from now. So they do have a lot of work to do to get there, but if you do think there's going to be an accord, it's probably going to have to happen in the next 12 months. And in order to implement that accord, especially even the ones that we know about so far, the accord on land, which was signed almost exactly a year ago, does include, it builds on the land restitution program somewhat. It would do things like carry out a cadastre, something Colombia's really never had, a mapping of all land holdings in the country. It would establish an unknown number of more campesino reserve zones, sort of areas where land holdings are limited and it's harder to buy and sell, and it's designed to be harder to concentrate land. And we're not sure, there may be some degree of economic and political autonomy in those areas. In order to carry out an accord like that, it will require more open confrontation with land grabbers, the same people with whom the well-intentioned Bogota elite has often been reluctant to. And it's also going to require a lot more difficult flow charts and step-by-step diagrams and resolving conflicting laws. In order to, how do you, these local elites can end up being real spoilers, both during the talks, but especially in the effort to implement what is agreed to. It's not really going to be possible to do this by bringing them into the tent somehow. You can condition their behavior, but they probably always will be outside of the process and opposing it. And there will be politicians, including a very prominent ex-president, who will be continuing to try to bring them into his coalition in opposition to the talks and the effort to implement them. So what do you do in a context like that? I agree very wholeheartedly with what Donny just said about organizing women landholders as a political force, and organizing other reformers, victims, indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, labor activists, and also within local elites and local business sectors, those who do want to play by the rules and who want to see a reduction in impunity, prosecutors and judges. Finding and identifying the reformers, helping them to organize, but I would add, keeping them alive is going to be a key goal over the next several years. It's really the base of what you've got to do for both the Bogota-based elites as well as the international donor community. Of course, all of this hinges on the current policies and good intentions being continued past the May and June elections. The polls are tightening, and assuming that the current government stays, that is really the prescription. And I'll leave it there, and I congratulate you, Donny, for a great piece of work.
Great. Well, Adam, given that you had less than 24 hours notice for participating in this forum, I mean, it's clear that you just draw on a wealth of experience and time spent analyzing what's going on in Colombia. We welcome your questions at this point, comments. Please wait for a microphone, and also do us the favor of identifying who you are and who you work with. The floor is open. Sure. Pat Fagan, right up here. First one. Yeah.
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. There was a really comprehensive presentation, Donny, and the comments of Adam complimented it very well.
Is that on?
What, is it on? Oh, I'm just not aiming it.
There
it's
you
the
go.
aim. Should I do it again? Or
Thank you.
or-
No. It's
Okay,
good.
we know where I am. Okay. I want to ask Donny now to go beyond the great detail she gave of all the obstacles and all of the complications and the goals, and to look a little bit further ahead in keeping with the initial objective, which you said was to look at the impact of land restitution laws, and in particular gender-based restitution on rural development. Is that so? The rural community, as you noted, the rural communities will not be as they once were. Rural life, there's no land reform foreseen. The concentration of land is in effect, and it's not going to be completely reduced, and it's not going to go back to the status quo ante, which is, I think, for better as well as for worse in many respects. So restitution is a case-by-case, parcel-by-parcel process. What do you see the connection to be between this kind of restitution, parcel by parcel, much of it, some of it to women, but not easily, will be for the restoration of rural communities and the sense of communities, rural organizations as they once were, but will be different in the future, and for rural development. And my own thoughts about that lead me to ask a further question, which is, is it really necessarily bad if women whose land is restored then decide 2 years later to sell it and to make different lives which would be much easier for them, or could be much easier for them?
Okay, thank you, Patricia, for this question. Well, it's starting with the last part of your comment. I think yes and no. If you look at an individual basis, it's not necessarily bad to sell your land. And of course, there's a lot of discussion going on about how do you say this in English? The unruralization, and about other roles for men and women, and particularly for women in rural areas. So from a individual, starting with the individual rights, this may be a good option. But I think that if there's not a plan, if this is not going to be part of a rural development strategy, it will be a threat to democratic rural development. If there's not a possibility to consolidate the rural land holdings. And I'm thinking of the importance of the peasant reserve, the reserve, zonas de reserva campesina, the peasant reserve zones. These are, this will depend for a big part on the outcomes of the peace negotiations. That is what I think. That is also where the hopes are, that these peasant reserve zones will get a new impulse, will be expanded, will be stronger, and then I think it is important to have a strategy that also women landowners are participants in a viable economic process of what's called in this first point of the first issue, first agreement, first accord, the solidarity economy and cooperatives and so on. That's what they're working on, and I think that's important to think of women as a whole in this. I think the other possibility is still there, that these small holdings will be sold. But it has to be part of a more comprehensive rural development program. Otherwise, it will give the free play to the big companies and the processes of accumulation.
Sure, right here.
I'm Sandy Price with the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Mr. Isacson, you mentioned well-intentioned Bogota elite. I think laws like this and meaningful peace talks are examples of that. But at the same time, I find it difficult to reconcile that sort of a statement with the continued policy that favors resource extraction and agribusiness. So how do you respond to the difficulty of reconciling those two?
I guess this way, I mean, it's interesting. President Santos has said a couple times that he wants to be a traitor to his class and that one of his idols is Franklin Roosevelt. And there's something to that. I think that those intentions are there. At the same time, most of that sector, we're talking, service industry, finance, the media industry, they would follow what we call a neoliberal program. I think to some extent, going to the last question, a land restitution is sort of but they would rather do it legally. I think that's the distinction, rather than this sort of rapacious, violent accumulation where you're kicking out entire communities. They would much rather give you a title to your land and then buy it from you. And that's a pretty big distinction, even if it will ultimately lead to more concentration of land or more extractive industries. I think the idea is to do it legally. And I think that the land restitution program is in part an effort to try to finally establish a set of rules that will then allow more free investment in those sectors, whether that's, it's not going to be a socialist or egalitarian model. And I think also the peace process itself is an effort to look at the map of Colombia and say, where are resources? Where can we expand investment in getting some of these extractive resources? But also, where can we not do it now because of the security situation? I think economically, it's a lot cheaper to try to negotiate with the FARC to get more access to those zones than to try to shoot your way in for another 10 or 20 years.
I'd actually like to follow up on that question, both to Donny and to Adam. We've talked about this a little bit. I was wondering if both of you could reflect on how the land restitution process, with all of its sort of moral and identity and even economic importance, how all of this meshes with the attempt to create a viable rural economy. And we don't yet know the content of or the details of the agrarian accord that was signed between the government and the FARC. But, you know, giving back these small lands, you know, to women or to families, even if in the best of circumstances communities can be restored, I mean, what is really sort of the option for a livelihood, for a viable livelihood, you know, that this model suggests? Sure.
Okay. It's a pity that the Bill of Law on Land and Rural Development is stuck in Congress for 2 years or more. Yeah. Because this makes discussion much more volatile. Yeah. But of course, there's a clear model behind what the restitution process is meant to do, and this is a kind of how do you say this? A double, two pathways that are. One is the strengthening of the peasant reserve zones, and this is, I think, one of the parts that is very important in the peace accord, because the FARC will be trying to expand them and to strengthen them as particular zones, which have a particular aspect, is that the land accumulation is limited. There is a limit to the land possessions you can have in these zones. So they're based on an idea of more peasant economy, but not in the sense of subsistence economy, but in the sense of peasant family holdings that are engaged and maybe form alliances and cooperatives, but more a solidarity economy than the other zones. And this is the other path. This is the expansion of the extractive and agro-industrial industries. But even in those zones, there will be also smallholders. So in this model, the idea is that smallholders will form alliances with the bigger entrepreneurial activities, and this is the model the government is working on, and the discussion is more about the proportion of peasant zones, reserve zones, and entrepreneurial activities. Well, we don't know. Maybe Adam can say.
Just very quickly, I'm not an expert on this either. The larger question is, how do you get a family farm model to work without government subsidies almost anywhere in the world? But however, in Colombia, the Santos government, especially when Camilo Restrepo was Minister of Agriculture, did say we have some serious inefficiencies in the rural sector, that there's the amount, I don't forget the figure, the amount of land given up to cattle ranching was way beyond what it should be for the amount of how productive it is. The amount of land given up to biofuels, I think they wanted to increase somewhat, but it was near where it was. And where Colombia was really lacking was in basic food crops, which of course can be grown by the smallholder sector. And that was foreseen somewhat in the rural development law, which was supposed to immediately follow on the land restitution law and go into Congress almost in that same Congress, but it did not, and it is still waiting. And I don't think that Lizarralde, the current agriculture minister, is pushing it as strongly, to say the least. But yeah, that however, I think the vision they have, though, is more food crops, more access to credit, obviously more titling, but also in order to prevent there from being a free-for-all buying and selling, and expansion of the campesino reserve zones in the context of the peace accord. What maybe is not being pushed enough is more infrastructure. Farm-to-market roads are going to be essential to having any viable rural sector, and Colombia's rural areas are often quite even behind a lot of Central American countries' rural areas in terms of the quality of the road network, and access to information about prices and just availability of seeds. And well, I'm not an agronomist, I know this, but I know that knowledge about prices and where the market stands has been always lacking. Although nowadays, even just since 2010 or so, almost everybody out there has a smartphone, and that may be changing more quickly than I can say.
In the middle here, we'll take two questions, in the middle and then across.
So I have a question kind of related to this set of questions, but at a different level of granularity. Is there any attempt, either in law, procedure, or in practice, perhaps more importantly, to make sure that the information that the Restitution Commission has, so you mentioned identification of hotspots, they have a list of particular claims, is informing the efforts at cadastral work and land titling, so you don't have maybe kind of benign neglect where a cadastral effort formalizes something that's currently a case in the restitution process.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Sorry, my name is Jolene Sanjak.
Got it, thanks. And sure.
My name is Maria Nieto. I'm from Media America. And my question, first of all, Ms. Martins, thank you so much for your presentation. It's very illustrating for me. My question is regarding the FARC victims on land grabbing. I understand what you said. You mentioned it briefly, and I understand, I agree with you, that since they are still in very strong presence in the mainly eastern part of the country, then the victims cannot come forward and say, I've been despojado from my land. So one question is how to deal with that, because we're in the middle of the process and we should actually start addressing that problem before we just sign something and then it's gone. And the second question goes to the new zones of, the new zones that are being negotiated in the peace process, because I'm really afraid that they might legitimize some of the land grabbing that it's already been happening for years and years and years. And for years, I mean 40 years. There are zones like, departments like Cauca, Huila, Tolima, and Caquetá especially, not to mention the very extreme part of the eastern extreme part of the country, that have been suffering from land grabbing from the FARC. So some of the peasants, it's been years and years and years that they have been out of the lands. So I was wondering what you think about it and how can we deal with those victims that are real? They're not visible right now, but they're real. Thank you.
Let's take one more there in the back.
Thank you for both expositions. I don't know if I can ask in Spanish. It's better for me.
Be fine. Please tell us who you are.
Mónica Moya from the Permanent Mission of Colombia. Okay. La pregunta básicamente radica en esto. Dentro de este contexto que se está presentando de negociaciones sobre el proceso de paz o poner fin al conflicto armado, dentro de este proceso de restitución de tierras, y entendiendo que este proceso se debe desarrollar independientemente de quién esté gobernando, en vísperas de que se va a elegir un presidente dentro de 15 días, ¿es conveniente o no que el presidente Santos siga en cabeza del Estado de Colombia o no habrá ninguna influencia negativa con respecto a esto?
Okay, I'll try to translate really briefly for people who is there anyone who doesn't understand Spanish? Don't be shy. If there's no need to translate, I won't, but if there are people who just don't know what she just asked, anyone? Okay, good. Well, basically, she's talking about, given the context of the peace process and the land restitution law, essentially, is it important that in about 2 weeks, on May 25th, that President Santos be reelected for the future of this process, especially the 2011 Ley de Víctimas. Good. Okay. Who wants to take any of the issues? Donny, why don't you start?
Well, I have to confess that the first question about information, I didn't understand very well. Can you just...
So, for example, you have, the Restitution Commission has identified a certain area as a hotspot where there's lots of claims on the land, and they also have a list of specific claims. So on the one hand, that's one institution of government that has information about claimants that are under some kind of dispute in a justice sense, right? On the other hand, there are plenty of programs now also deriving from the peace accords and some existing before that to go out and formalize land rights and give land titles, create cadastral maps. When they go out, if they go out to a place that's a hot spot from the restitution perspective, will they have that information in hand?
Yeah, well...
So they don't inadvertently create a new conflict or formalize something that's in dispute, I guess.
No, the information, I think the information is shared. The information is shared, and the information is shared and goes in the administrative process to the judicial process. And then it is public on the web. All court rulings are on the web. So I think there is no... and this is very particular because, of course, a court ruling is very detailed and gives information about people, about their names, about even their numero de cédula, their identification cards, and so on. So, well, I think it's an interesting point because there is a kind of, you could say, security risk in this. Because all information is readable on the website, yeah, when the court ruling has been made, yeah. The second question about the land grabbing by the FARC, well, I was saying that there may be a difference between the South and the North. The research I've been doing and the court rulings that are already done, they are more about in the northern part of the country. There is one region, Tolima, the south of Tolima, and this is was a FARC region, and there are cases of land grabbing and dispossession, but there are still less cases by the FARC than by the paramilitary zones. So. There is also a different relationship between the FARC and their strongholds and the local elites. You know, the cases of the paramilitary, they were many times they were working or they were used by local elites for I think in FARC strongholds, traditional strongholds, this is a different situation. So it will be, I think, part of the peace agreements. What will happen to the land that is in the FARC strongholds? And there are also talks about that giving land to ex-combatants may be one of the possibilities for a peace agreement. We are still not at that point of negotiations. But so these are all factors that make it very difficult to talk about these situations in FARC strongholds in comparison to those territories that were territories in permanent um, combat about territorial control. And about the third point, the third question, makes it a difference? Well, I think it's the restitution process is one of the very important processes pushed by President Santos. So I think not all candidates are equally interested in pushing forward a restitution process. I will leave it with that.
Sure. And Donny, you referred several times in your presentation to the issue of political will, and that's obviously going to be a key issue. I mean, there may be something on the books, and then actually carrying it forward is another issue. Adam?
Sure, just quickly, on FARC land holdings or FARC land grabbings, we don't really know the extent of it. However, we spent the last 8 rounds of the Havana talks talking about drug policy. Hopefully they'll go to an accord on that agenda item soon. Most likely the next agenda item to follow will be the victims and how to achieve justice for the victims. That will be what they'll start talking about. Now the FARC have already been saying, we demand that before we even start talking about the victims, that there be some sort of commission to determine the causes of the conflict and put some context on this, which could take months and months and months. If the government wants to, obviously, okay, go ahead and do that. Do it in a month or 2 tops. A good response that the government could have to the FARC would be, okay, but this commission should also get more information about FARC land holdings. The FARC are still, having some trouble, I think, getting, you could tell from their statements, getting their mind around the fact that they do have thousands of victims. And that could be, the land grabbing is certainly part of that. So maybe that should be something that is looked at, but it'll certainly be something that is negotiated because the Santos government officials, including the Minister of Defense, have talked a lot about FARC land grabs. And as far as the candidates, of all of the major candidates, only one said he will not continue the peace process. That's Jaime Zuluaga, the candidate of Uribe. I believe even Marta Lucía Ramirez in the Conservative Party has said she would continue the talks. Would they continue land restitution? I mean, it's the law. They would have to continue. The question is how much energy they would, with how much energy they would continue it. If the Uribe, I think yes, for the most part, just about everybody would. Certainly Enrique Peñalosa, another key candidate there, shares a lot of the same views as President Santos on this. But if the Uribe group were to come into power, then it would be somewhat in question. And the way I would illustrate that is when President Santos did come into power, he supported quite quickly the prosecution of Uribe's Minister of Agriculture, Andrés Felipe, ¿cómo se llama? Arias, thank you. And also I remember when he nominated his nominee to be the new head of INCODER, the land distribution agency, came in, he publicly made some statements about how he encountered a total disaster, despelote, that it was like taken over by corruption and completely malfunctional. So that gives you a sense of the difference in energy with which both governments might pursue this issue.
Any other question? Oh my gosh, wow, everybody's waking up. All right, let's take, let me see, how are we doing on time? Well, let's see, let's take 2 more rounds. So we will start, Patricia, right here in the, raise your hand, there you go.
Patricia Cortez, Embassy of Colombia. And thank you, Donna, for your presentation. It's really comprehensive and it's incredibly well documented. And thank you, Cynthia and Adam. Colombia's land restitution process and as the implementation of the victims' law, it's very unique in terms of, I mean, it's been already not only the law, but the implementation, while it's still the conflict. So it really not only shows the political will, but it's also very unique in terms of, let's say, international perspective. So that's my question, Donna, if since this is very unique, and that's why the outcomes as well, the challenges have to see or have to be reviewed under the Colombian context. How do you see in terms of the, let's say, sharing lessons or contribution or even comparisons with other processes? Other processes, let's say on land restitution, for example, the other day we were reading about the one in Kosovo, which obviously took place as a part of post-transitional justice. I mean, it took like 12 years. It was a different context, but I would like to just to hear perhaps your views about that. How do you see, of course, in a post-future, I mean, that contribution in international perspective?
Over here.
Thank you. My name is Veronica. I'm a researcher at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to ask, maybe going back to the gender issue, you were talking about the power of local elites, and I wanted to know if at any point in your research, how is the women's situation in terms of, do they get to be in the local elites politically or economically? Are they part in some of these regions of the local elites? And in regions where women get to power at the local level, does that make any difference in the situation of the women who are going back there trying to manage their land? I don't know if maybe it's too early to know because it's a very recent process that's undergoing, but if you could see some of this in your research. Thank you.
Let's take one more here from Dorley. Right here with the red scarf. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dorley Castañeda. I work at the World Bank as a consultant. And I have like two questions. One about the paro agrario. What have you seen, the role of women during the paro agrario? Have you seen anything during your research, if there is women groups coming in that discussions, or what is the voice of women there? And the other one is, we always talk about land restitution, but the law is also victims reparation. So what is the linkages that you have found during your research between these two programs and like the potential of working with both? Thanks.
Yeah. Maybe I start with the last question, and I will take together those two questions about women and the local part of local elites, or women get to power at the local level, and the role of women groups and women's reparations. Well, one of the things to take into account is that at 50 years of conflict fought in the countryside, dismantled many, disorganized many social organizations and many social movements. And this was the case with the peasant organization. This was also the case with the national rural women's organizations like An Muziek. Nevertheless, we found in the historical memory work that at the local level, there were women trying to go on with their organizational work in a very silent way under other names. They were organized as housewives or organized as productive organizations or protecting the environment, all politically non-offensive, not dangerous names, you know, forms of organization. I think that there is the land restitution process as such makes it possible to build on these local initiatives, and I think this is very important because it's coming from the grassroots, and what we see that. Mostly women's organizations are centralized, they're Bogota-based or the big cities based, and now they're just trying to reach out. They have reached out a lot, but these are like networks. And I think that the restitution process makes it possible to bring together these two processes. from the center to the regions, and building local organizations, and they will meet at a certain moment. So this is one of the positive things I am seeing in this whole restitution process and gender. Well, I think that in terms of empowering women, there are women part of local elites, but in gender terms, I don't think they're so empowered. You know, if we're talking about women in all kinds of Lagata, for instance, we see that we are not talking about women's rights. We are not talking about women only being victims. Of course, they are also perpetrators. So that's not the point. But if we want to talk about enhancing women's rights, we have to look at the grassroots organizations. And then, Patricia, sorry, I have a problem. You were referring to which experience, international experience? Yeah. Where?
Perspective.
Ah, Kosovo.
Yes,
Yeah.
the international
Okay.
perspective of
Yeah.
Colombia's experience,
Yeah.
taking into account that it's quite unique, that is
Yeah.
while in the conflict, and comparing to, there are others, let's say Kosovo, or it's more your
Yeah.
vision on the
Yeah.
international impact or experience.
Yeah, well, I think that the Kosovo experience is, well, this is one of the cases of a very different context. In the first place, we are talking about a country with other kind of development problems and development levels. Second, the most problematic situation in Kosovo was housing, not so much land. And housing was also part of a former socialist state. This, in part, was this also the case of land. So this makes it different. And then in the third place, the ethnic conflict. So the whole restitution of land and housing and the gender issues involved were intersecting with ethnic problems and with a particular way of property, which was state property. So it's not that easy to, in that case, to make a comparison, because the problems were more concentrated to how to restitute and to maintain ethnic diverse communities. And of course, there were gender questions, but they were different from the Colombian situation. Yeah.
Adam, do you want to jump in? Use your mic. That's all right.
Just very briefly, I don't have much to add. On the question of comparative experiences, I mean, you make a very good point, Patricia, that even the semi-successful experiences with land restitution elsewhere have taken as many as a decade or two, and it's only been 2 years, and there is an armed conflict still happening. As the years progress, though, we're going to see, the bureaucracy and the agencies will be well established, and perhaps the armed conflict, at least on paper, will end, which will lay bare more of the more difficult challenges, like the ones I talked about. As far as the paro agrario, that was a good question. I've been in the last year, since the paros really began, I've been to Valle and Chocó, but I haven't been to Boyacá or Catatumbo or any of the places where the Eje Cafetero, where the protests have been strongest. So I haven't actually talked to leaders in the field. I've talked to a lot of representatives of those organizations in Bogotá, and I have been impressed that they are I was surprised by how many women there were among the leaders of the movement, and also how young a lot of them were. particularly the ones from Catatumbo, but I don't know if they're representative of the people out in the regions themselves. Well, I mean, obviously they represent them, but I don't know if they represent them demographically. And I would just add that when you do look at the list of land rights defenders who have been killed in the last few years, which is a number that has increased a lot since the law was passed, a large portion of them are women.
Patricia, if I could just jump in and add one or two comments. I mean, I think your question really does highlight the extent to which Colombia is unique, not only in implementing the victims and land restitution law during the conflict, but also establishing this Commission on National Reconciliation, Reparations and Reconciliation while the war is still going on, that has produced, as Donny well knows, I mean, extensive reports on, instances of massacres and violence during the war. And as much as that reflects, I think, political will and a sense that, we don't know if an accord is going to be successful, and therefore we're going to do these things anyway, I think there are limitations to doing it during a conflict. And you see that in the demand by the FARC now to establish a truth commission that would take up, the cases that it considers important and perhaps have international, participation to look, more broadly at a set of cases and have a different set of victims help define, what cases are selected for investigation. But also, the ability to implement, the restitution is limited by, the existence of the conflict. The FARC victims are not so much a part of a universe, in areas where the FARC is still, in control. And the examples, I don't know internationally, but the other examples in Latin America certainly are that, these processes take place after, the signing of an accord. And so you have an environment, even if they're not successful, and I would argue they haven't really been that successful, particularly in Central America, you still have a framework of peace or, no longer shooting war, in which the state can come in and international agencies can come in and help make this go forward. So I think it's, Colombia as always breaks the mold. It's always looking for innovative and creative ways, to address the long-standing problems of violence and particularly the, the number of, of victims of the conflict. But I do believe that to make it sort of whole, you do need, a fully implemented, you need a peace accord in a post-conflict environment. We have time for just a couple more questions. Let's take yes over here, and then in the back, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Donny, for your presentation. I have two questions.
Your name, please? I'm sorry.
Yes, Angélica Ocampo, Universidad Javeriana, Georgetown at ISS Erasmus University. I'm doctoral researcher right now, so I'm visiting researcher at Georgetown. So I'm very concerned about the real conditions, the material conditions, and the symbolic conditions of young people, specifically peasants in Colombia, and peasants who are experiencing this armed conflict. So my question is if within the framework of the law, is there any criteria for restitution considering not only gender equality, but also generational equality? So are the judges considering intersections among that? And on the other hand, you said a very important statement talking about political transformation and political action, and we have to organize women as landowners. I want to know your position about who are we, in the sense that it's talking about positionality, and I'm interested in listening to you about the position of academia. How is our participation in this we? I want to know how you see that.
Okay, and there was one over on this side. Yeah, right here.
So my name is, Can you hear me?
Name, I'm sorry?
My name is Gabriela Vaz Rodriguez. I'm a student at the University of Maryland and a land administration researcher, consultant. My question is on the execution of these rulings. I'm curious to know how easy it is to execute these rulings once they have been taken in practice, considering the local political economy. And regarding that, are there particular characteristics of the parcels that benefit from these rulings? Is there a bias towards, for example, parcels that have been abandoned as opposed to parcels that are still occupied by people that belong to an elite? I mean, who is really benefiting? How easy is it to benefit from these rulings, depending on the situation of the land?
Okay, final words. Donny.
Okay. Well, for Angelica, very interesting, generational equality. One of the critical issues is, it has been mentioned by many institutions, by the Ministry of Agriculture, by Land Restitution, that is that the peasant population is becoming older. They're only the old people that are reclaiming their land, and the young people are going to the cities. At the same time, and this is very interesting because you mentioned this, in the paros agrarios, they're young people. They're very young people. And well, one of a researcher I talked to once, they said, well, this has to do with that their parents have been killed in certain regions. This was talking about Catatumbo particularly. And these young people are taking up their struggles. But I think both, it's very interesting to see this new phenomenon. But so there are two tendencies, and I don't know what is really the dominant one. The restitution process is not working nor on gender equality or generational equality in terms of redistribution of land. It's only restoring rights. So they are doing nothing revolutionary, not for women, not for... They may be transformative in the sense of I was talking about formalizing land rights, and the questions are about sustainability. And they're formalizing land rights to younger generations. That is interesting. But they can't do this in terms of equality. It depends on the situation. What they are doing is, it's even a little bit strange. They are defining inheritance rights for the children of the couples or of the women or of the men who had many times multiple households. So they're trying to do justice also to the new generations. But this is different from working on gender equality or gender or generational equality in the distribution of land. The position of we. Well, of course, I'm talking as an academic. But at the same time, I am trying to think of both civil society and policy recommendations. So if I'm talking about we should organize women as landowners, I'm basically thinking of the institutional part. And not everybody will agree with that, but I think that the history also showed that institutionally, officially organized peasant organizations, they always broke away and became more independent and more radical. So this, I think this is not a preoccupation. I think the important thing is that they will be empowered as new landowners, and that this will be a constantly growing network. And of course, they should conflate or connect to all those different efforts of women's organizations, of victims' organizations. That shouldn't be parallel processes, but I think it's a good thing to think of institutional organizing as part of all those women that have land rights now. They should form this kind of an organization and not individual productive projects and individual access to social services. It's all okay. But we should think of rebuilding a social fabric with this kind of strategies. Well, about the execution of rulings, well, I have to say I forgot about exactly what your question was about.
So it's basically taking into account the political economy and the existence of elites and the concentration of land that occurred in the past years. Once a ruling is made to restitute a parcel, how easy is it, like in practice, to give the land back to that peasant, and also if there's a bias towards land that has been abandoned, for example?
Yeah, okay. Two things. More or less 30% of the rulings that are now in place are rulings about with what's called oppositories. Yeah. But one of the things I've been looking at is that they're mostly what I've called horizontal conflicts. They're not too difficult to do. They're not with big powers. There are two cases where they ruled in favor of the victims against land accumulation. There are two cases. But this is of well, no, I didn't look at 900. I looked at 66. So there are two cases of 66 where vertical powers, where landed elites were refrained, where the land was given back to the victims. That's, I think that's, well, it's difficult to see the trends, you know. Then the second point is, and this is a general point and a particular point for gender issues, is that the judge orders protection, orders productive project, orders affiliation to social security, etc., etc. But it's not the judge's competition to do the monitoring or the follow-up of these measures. It is the victims' unit's competition. Yeah, and we don't know, we don't have data at this moment how the victims' unit is doing this. And if they're doing it, let's say that they're doing it and they're complying with their tasks, it is again a piecemeal approach. Yeah, it is again a case by case. So this is one of the very negative, very concerns I have about the process, about the post-restitution process. And this is also so for protection. Protection is ordered by the judges. And it goes, what I have seen is that they say, okay, the armed forces should accompany these people back to the factual handing over of the land, you know? And then afterward, what happens? So.
On the execution of rulings, I would recommend taking a look at the report that Human Rights Watch did on this last September, which came to some pretty grim conclusions on the verticality and also the security of some of the recipients. Now, when that report came out, Ricardo Sabogal, who should be in this chair, disputed a lot of the findings, and I think he would have a lot more updated numbers on that. The Human Rights Report is based on data that's almost a year old. And finally, the question of protection for the recipients is crucial. The protection unit is assigning people to protect people, but ultimately you can't have a policeman stationed to every single land plot there where people have received or had their land restituted in dangerous areas. You just can't. And the best way to protect people ultimately is going to be to increase the probability of punishment for those who are the intellectual authors of the killers of land rights defenders. And just before giving up, pardon my reach, I mean, it's never fun to read a 400-page PDF, but if you can download La Tierra en Disputa from the webpage of the Historical Memory Commission, in my view, it's the most compelling and gripping report that the Commission put out, other than the final one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Great. Thank you, Donny, for this presentation, for all the work that has gone into it over the years, including your work with the Commission. Thank you, Adam, for filling in at the very last minute. You've both been very generous with your time and with your expertise. Please join me in thanking Donny and Adam. And we'll all buy Donny's book when it comes out. Right?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, that was
Thanks
great.
so much.
Oh, I love these discussions, though. It's
Oh, thank you.
Qué pena, Ricardo. Qué pena. Y te debo los datos, ¿no? ¿Te acuerdas? Quiero presentar a Andrés, que es quien es la